You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Orn Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Today we are joined by Paul Mason. Paul is a journalist, writer and filmmaker actively engaged in the struggle for social, racial and climate justice. His new book, How to Stop Fascism, History, Ideology, Resistance, is out later this month. Paul, it's a pleasure to have you on.
And thanks for inviting me. I look forward to talking about the book.
Yeah, definitely. And I thought the book was incredibly interesting. As a student of politics, I studied politics at university. I love reading about topics that bring together history and politics. I think people like to see history through one lens and they like to see politics through one lens, but I think the more that you read about both, you realize that they're just intertwined between one another. So it was a great and fascinating book, and one that is very relevant to the times we are living in right now. I think a great place to start, Paul, would be to define what fascism is and why should we all be concerned with it.
Well, the book itself is, I hope, written for an audience that thinks it knows a bit about this question. They kind of, would recognise a picture of Hitler if they saw it and know that he killed 6 million Jews, but probably doesn't really get or couldn't answer the question in a pub quiz. How did he come to power? How exactly did this guy, and indeed how did Mussolini, 10 years before, come to power in an ostensibly liberal democracy? And the reason why that's important to us is that I think we are seeing some of the same conditions. There are big differences, but we do have a resurgent far right. In each country, it's different. So in the United Kingdom, 5 separate far right candidates stood in the Batley by-election, and each got around about less than 100 votes. So am I worried about them taking power? No. In America, you've got the far right in the form of various guises. So outright people who literally march with flags that look like Nazi flags. Okay, so they're clearly fascist. We'll come to the definition. You've got this group, the Proud Boys, initially formed around misogyny, around the defense of white men against feminist oppression. Okay, but they transformed themselves very quickly into a semi-armed group, so armed with baseball bats and defensive armour, breaking up Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Are they fascist? Yes. Are the militias fascist? Well, they've been around a long time. They carry guns. They stormed the Capitol. You can't get more fascist than trying to dissolve an elected assembly of the most, indeed, one of the most democratic countries on earth, the United States. So the concern is not that they are going to immediately succeed in their insurrections or indeed win a by-election in Batley. The concern is that they have very powerful allies in what we call right-wing populism. We could talk about this, the kind of right-wing, racist, misogynist politics that we see inside the Republican Party, parts of the Conservative Party, and all kinds of right-wing electoral parties in Europe. The biggest threat at the moment being the Rassemblement National, which is the French Marine Le Pen far-right party. The thesis of the book is this: that you can define fascism, we'll come to it. There's fascism, defined, small groups, violent, anti-democratic. There's right-wing populism, electoral parties, more acceptable, often on double digits in the polls, working through parliamentary institutions, even if they diss them, even if they don't like those institutions. For about 30 years, political science and the polling industry and pundits in general have kind of assumed that right-wing populism was a firewall against fascism. So if you hate migrants and if you think white men are oppressed by feminism and you're anti-woke, then instead of going down the route of putting on a uniform and marching and with a kind of Zeke Heil salute, you go and vote UKIP, okay? Or you go and vote for somebody like Donald Trump in America. The problem is the firewall is on fire. Right-wing populism is no longer preventing the rise of fascism. In the book, I argue it is amplifying it. So to the question of definitions, the book is in a way a kind of warning about this definition obsession, because definitions are not explanations. I could define, if you want, what a fascist group, what are the attributes of a fascist group. It is almost always violent, and we'll come to this. It is symbolically violent. The violence they perpetrate is not because they just want to kick somebody's head in. It's they want to teach a lesson to the rest of society. One. Two, they're anti-democracy. They believe the state, as in Mussolini's Italy and Nazi Germany, should subsume everything, so that we, people, no longer live for ourselves, but we live only for the fascist state. They are, the core of their modern belief system is the Great Replacement Theory, which says that migration is enacting a genocide against white Europeans, and that the agents of this occupation, as they call it, are feminists and Marxists, and indeed liberals, because liberalism is equated to Marxism. In its modern format, and this is one of the defining features that still delineates fascism from just right-wing populism, fascists believe in and want and are waiting for a catastrophic day in which a global ethnic civil war breaks out, in which all the guns come out, all the tins of beans they've stored, all the they want to end this modernity that we've had with a huge reversal back to something pre the French Revolution. So I would say that that's my kind of definition of fascism, but it could be encompassed in one sentence. It's the fear of freedom. Fascism is the fear of freedom that I think exists probably in all of us because of our socialization, triggered by the realization that freedom might not be far away. And we maybe explore this. This is what I think that what I've learned from my re-explanation of the Freudians, the left-wing Freudians who in the 1930s were arguing with the far left. Look, you say this is all about class and capitalism. There's something deeper going on, and that's what I've come to believe, that what people, those Proud Boy groups, people in the far right groups in India, far right groups who support Bolsonaro in Brazil, they're not just fighting a class war. They're fighting a war over the reversal of modernity.
Definitely, and I know that there's a quote that you put in the book said, "Fear of freedom triggered by the sight of people achieving freedom who are not supposed to." So it's that idea that there's people in society that they're fearing are getting the freedom that they have, and in the access to that freedom, they'll then lose their own.
That's very palpable when you look at the reaction of white supremacists, which unfortunately are numerous in the United States. It was it was Colin Kaepernick, and then the Black Lives Matter protests enraged them to the point where theirs is not, I think, primarily an economic dislocation. Many of the people who went on the 6th of January demonstration that stormed the Capitol were middle class, quite well off, albeit dislocated. Something bad's happened to them. They're what the psychologist Wilhelm Reich called in the 30s people in trouble. But they're not poor, not a lot of them anyway. What they fear is that their privileged status as a white person. So, hailing a taxi cab in New York, New York City, try it while being black. It's just all those little things, being stopped for a motoring offence while being black in the United States is a life-threatening experience for many people. So what that cohort of white racists fears is that black people will achieve not just formal legal equality, but actual social and juridical equality. They will be stopped by a policeman, and the policeman will say, "Hi, you're speeding. There's a £30 fine. Goodbye." That's what they fear. Now, it's the history. When you look, I did something that historians probably shouldn't do. I looked at the history of Italian fascism, French fascism, German fascism through the lens of now, looking for parallels in order to educate myself and the readers as to what we do about it. And one of the most interesting episodes is this critical moment in the rise of Italian fascism. The workers had seized their factories and they voted not to do a revolution but to accept workers' control. And in September 1920, that whole occupation of the factories movement was winding down. But on the land, which most left-wing people thought, yeah, the land, it's an interesting place. On the land, the occupation of the land was going crazy. Millions of Italian peasants seized control of their land and started farming it. That's all they did. And the landlord, and they were dictating to the landlords. There was this contract. You have to do the landlord's chores. Every pig you kill, the landlord owns one leg of it, even if it's your pig. You can't get married unless the landlord gives you permission. You can't go to a club. You can't literally go to a club in a town without the landlord knowing about it. And the peasants said, enough of all this. Here's a contract. They literally put contracts on the table of the landlords and said, right, we get all of the pig. We get to decide when we get married. And all the economic things that went with that. The landlords, one of the quotes was, the landlords sitting in their clubs, all they could think about was machine guns. They just wanted to solve this. Because suddenly, then there were local elections and the peasants who'd all joined the Socialist Party won. And suddenly there are people with no shoes sitting on the benches of the local council and the red flag flying above it, and you, the landlord, have been running it from time immemorial. What do? Well, what they did, they said, well, who can solve this? We don't have an army. There's rule of law in Italy. It's a liberal democracy. There's a bloke called Mussolini. He's been marching around Milan, breaking the heads of people with people called fascists. Right, well, we'll have some of that. What fascism was at that point, in late 2020, was not a political movement. It was simply a technique. It was get 100 guys in ex-army uniforms, arm them with two things the peasants don't have: trucks and telephones. And they go by night in a coordinated way to a village. They drag the socialist leaders out of their beds. They tar and feather them, force feed them castor oil, which makes them have diarrhea, beat the crap out of them, and then make them sign a document saying, I've resigned as a councillor. And by the way, I'm leaving the village where my family have lived for 1,000 years. In the space of 4 months, a million-strong movement of Italian peasants was destroyed in that manner. And the police just stood by and occasionally arrested the peasants. Now, that was fear of freedom triggered by a glimpse of freedom. They saw a bunch of people who should not be in the local council, who should not be dictating to them, who were meant to be like, so doing this, doffing their cap, yes sir, rise. And it was so violent that they looked for a technique, and the technique was what we call squadrismo, the formation of these fighting squads that would go and just, in a mobile warfare technique, go and attack people with symbolic violence. I think that's what we're seeing in the United States. I think we're seeing it in parts of Europe as well. We're seeing white people say, hold on a minute, this shouldn't be happening. In Europe, it's, hold on a minute, why is a million refugees, 1.5 million refugees crossing the border? That shouldn't be happening. In India, we're seeing an increasingly Hindu nationalist BJP Party, which runs the country, turn against Muslims in a way which is really threatening to that country's multi-ethnic and multi-religious constitution. And so I think that's the parallel. They don't have to, we always knew they wouldn't arrive with actual swastikas on their arm. They wouldn't arrive necessarily doing the same things. But what they are doing, and what I try and show in the first chapter of the book, is they're doing everywhere on earth. The far right are committing symbolic violence in order to assemble a movement and an ideology that can get ready for the big day, day X as they call it, when they finally do, as in Italy, go to war with all the people they don't like, which will include me and probably you.
Definitely include the both of us. I think the scary thing is when you're reading it, the history of it, and in Italy and Germany, it's sort of just contained within Europe. But now you can see the spread in many different countries, in many different cultures, in many different religious differences, and it's very troubling when I see the situation now, because it's not contained in just one area. I mean, it's spreading everywhere. Can you just speak quickly? I know we were talking about Trump and January the 6th and the storming of Capitol Hill. Why was that such a pivotal moment? Because as I was watching it, I was sort of, as most people probably were, they were just sort of, how has this happened?
Yeah.
How can someone do that? How can someone incite that type of violence, even as they're leaving office? Like, what were some of the conditions in order for that to happen?
Okay. There was a debate at the time that unfortunately involved parts of the left, which said this is not real. It's just performance art. That it happened, but it wasn't a serious attempt to seize power. It was just a kind of last gasp of a bunch of sad people. And Trump, the argument goes, is no worse than George W. Bush, and therefore let's not worry about what happened. I take the opposite view. I mean, I say in the book that there is a danger that the 6th of January 2020, the storming of Capitol Hill, could be seen by history as a kind of mirror event to the event that started the American Civil War, or rather that prefaced the American Civil War, which was John Brown, as in John Brown's Body, the famous battle hymn of the Republic. John Brown, a fanatical anti-slavery guy, got a posse of people and tried to seize an armory and launch a slave uprising in the southern United States. He was stopped very easily and quickly. But within a year, there was a civil war, in the sense that, or within 2 years, there was a civil war, in the sense that what you can identify that as the kind of moment of sporadic and uncontrolled and kind of unpredictable violence that then set off a series of events. I think it's entirely possible that the 6th of January leads to what? Before we go into what happened, leads to what it's already led to: widespread denialism on the American right that in any way they were responsible. They're now blaming the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, for it happening. They said anti-fascists were in the crowd at the time, and they still say it. They are refusing an investigation. There are ultra right-wing Republicans marching around protesting against the investigation and systematically covering up for what was, I believe, and I think the evidence is there, a concerted attempt to block the results of the election. Now, come to what happened. It is clear that from the moment he realised he was likely to lose in the middle of 2020, Trump began the narrative of stop the steal. This election is going to be stolen by postal votes in largely black states. Okay. Then he loses, despite terrifyingly adding 10 million votes to his original total. He loses. He looks around until the 18th of December. It was 2020. It was possible that the Supreme Court would overturn the election. Numerous states joined a lawsuit to try and get the election overturned. Numerous states, incredibly, worrying even there, state governments. But on December the 18th, he has a meeting with his key crazies, Mike Flynn, who by now has moved to the far right. Sidney Powell, this lawyer who keeps talking about the Kraken, the storm, which is fascist code for Day X, the day when it all kicks off. And he says, can we launch a military coup? No, is the answer. And by now, the generals, we now know because of new memoirs that are coming out, generals are saying this guy's going to turn the country in the Third Reich. We need to step back. We need to put the army out of his control. So it's clearly he can't do it that way. What's he decided to do then? He says on the 18th of December, having ruled out an actual military coup or state of emergency, January the 6th, it's going to be wild. Trump tweets January the 6th. So it's a long time. He mobilizes the Proud Boys. He mobilizes, puts out the word. His people put out the word. So they brought that crowd. On the day, off script, we now know it's off his script, he calls for them to march to the White House. To the Capitol. What did he want them to do? Pressure Mike Pence and indeed numerous right-wing senators into blocking the results of the election. Meanwhile, he's got the Department of Justice. he's pressuring them to try and annul the election. So this is not a performance. This is a mobilized mob, mobilized by. I pointed out in the book, and it's one of my favorite phrases about the far right. Hannah Arendt, the German philosopher, described fascism, the original fascism, as the temporary alliance of the elite and the mob. And on that platform, that's what you had outside on Pennsylvania Avenue. On that day, you had rich people, Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump, all of the acolytes, all the American ultra-right-wing rich people, and the mob. The most dangerous part of that mob turned out not to be the organised fascists, because they broke in. Okay, they were the ones who broke in, the militias and the Proud Boys. Proud Boys took the barriers down, the militias broke the windows. It's really clear they'll be indicted for conspiracy. But in the middle of it all are recently radicalised people who only came because Trump asked them. And they had no plan, I don't think. But when they saw Trump calls for it, the fascists do it, they just joined in. And this is, I believe, this is how it will come to understand Ashley Babbitt, the right-wing protester who was killed by a policeman. She's now become, the Nazis had this martyr, Horst Wessel. And they had this song about Horst Wessel. It was the song with which they conquered Europe. Well, Ashley Babbitt is the Horst Wessel of now. She's the kind of martyr. But she wasn't an organizer. She voted Obama. She was an ex-service person who'd just been radicalized. So the entire thing is significant historically, because even as we speak, states in America are, in response to Trump's loss, changing the law essentially so that black people and migrants can't vote. That's what's happening all over the southern United States and the Midwest. We get to 2022, the right will take control of both legislatures, and then the only question is whether or not Trump comes back, or a Trump-like figure comes back, or whether we get a more traditional right-wing conservative who says, well, thank you very much, Trump. Thanks for destroying American democracy. The Democratic Party in power is now impossible. Let's kind of go back to a more authoritarian, mainstream neocon kind of figure. That's the end of American democracy.
Yeah, it seems central to the idea of fascism is this idea, I know you talk about in the book, of democratic decay. So the decay of a functioning democracy. Does that just give precedence for fascism to rise? And is it something that should be very careful of, in the sense that we want to keep democracy and the institution of democracy as the thing that we're trying to save? Because if we don't, that gives rise to people like fascists.
There's two things. First of all, democratic decay is a phenomenon that is well documented by NGOs like Freedom House. During the period since the 2008 crisis, when globalization has fallen apart and people's preparedness to play the game of there's a single system in the world that everybody kind of adheres to, and the rich get rich and the poor don't. Instead, that's kind of fallen apart. During that process, over the last 14 years, we've seen a big slide in democratic standards. Is that fascism? No, it isn't. But what we know from certainly Germany in this period in the 1920s, which is known to history as the Weimar Republic. It's the first post-war republic, post-World War I republic of Germany. It was ultra-democratic, and over time, its democracy decayed to the point at which it could no longer really either combat Hitler or indeed inspire people to defend democracy, because they kind of lost faith in it. So when we talk about democratic decay, I think we should talk about both the institutional decay and the decaying belief that democracy is good. We are certainly seeing that. We're seeing it in America. I'm afraid to say we're seeing it in the United Kingdom as well. Now, having said that, that phenomenon, I think, arises out of the breakup of globalization, the need for national elites to break their own rules. So you look at in our country, Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament illegally, lied to the Queen, repeatedly lies to Parliament, continually breaks the ministerial code and allows his ministers to do so with impunity. That's not fascism. But what it does is it then creates, I think, the fertile ground for people to say, well, is democracy any good anyway? Because China doesn't have democracy, and it's the most successful economy in the world. And America, if you look at America, yeah, the Americans have basically squared away their black population. They can't effectively influence the outcome of elections come the mid-2020s because of all these new laws. And does anybody believe what's good about it anyway? And if you ask people, you ask the average sixth former studying politics, they'll kind of come out with the essay question. Yeah, it's not bad, it's good. Yeah. Do they really believe it? See, what we now know is that a lot of people didn't really believe in women's rights, black equality, and LGBTQ rights. Actually, they were ticking boxes when they were doing job interviews. They didn't really believe it. And it's the first chance that someone came along and legitimised homophobia, transphobia, and outright racism, as UKIP has done, as the Brexit Party did, as GB News is doing, people say, yeah, I never believed it anyway. My fear is there'll come a time when people say, yeah, I never really believed in democracy anyway. I'm not going to go to the streets to defend Parliament. Why would I do that? That's the moment fascism becomes less. It's not right now. It's a threat, and we'll come to this. It's a very big ideological threat. It's an ideological virus in a way, working its way through people's minds. But the moment when the possibility of fascism begins is the moment when people don't want to defend democracy.
I think it'd be good to talk about the fact that it's an ideological war more than a war against, for instance, in the book you say that Trump isn't a fascist. You say Trump is not a fascist, but it's the idea of the ideology spreads when there's, like you said, a fertile ground for it. So what is the space for it to fester in such a way, and what are the conditions?
Yeah. Let's just clear this up about Trump, because there's lots of current books about fascism, there's lots of academic books about fascism, and there is therefore a debate between historians and journalists, and I'm one of them, about whether Trump is a fascist. I don't think that Trump can be classified as a fascist because what he really is a right-wing populist crook, and he has a dynastic intent. He wants to put his family in power. He wants to run America as an anti-democracy. But there's plenty of people like that. Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil. I would argue that none of them conform to any definition of fascism that can be stood up by academia or history. However, and this is where I begin to part company with the academics, first of all, let's remember, definitions are not explanations, nor can they capture movement very well. And this is what comes out of the work of the great historian Robert O. Paxton, who's influenced me a lot. Robert Paxton says, look, you can create a zoology of kind of, like with a butterfly collection. Here's a red admiral. Here's a kind of another one. Here's another. You can describe different bits of political reality, but what you can never really do in that way is understand how one morphs into the other. And having said that Trump is not currently a fascist, I would also say that Steve Bannon, his key co-thinker, has overtly moved in the direction of what we call traditionalist philosophy. And those traditionalist philosophers, Alexander Dugin and the rest of them, they are fascists. Mike Flynn, having been indicted and then pardoned, goes way towards the QAnon conspiracy. The QAnon conspiracy theory is a quasi-fascist ideology. So, however, what does fascism want? Right now, let's remember, the answer to the quiz question, how did fascism come to power, is that both in 1922 and 23, both Hitler and Mussolini attempted an armed march on the relevant capital. Mussolini marched on Rome. He assembled a private army. The army caved in, gave their weapons over, and the liberal government just basically tried to call a state of emergency, but the king handed Mussolini power. We're still a parliamentary democracy, albeit with the communists in jail, and it was a kind of power grab. Hitler tried the same thing a year later, and fortunately, the police in Bavaria opened fire on Hitler, and it was only because the guy next to him took the bullet that Hitler lived. And so then, 10 years later, Hitler comes to power again in a process of assembling a big armed movement, the Sturmabteilung, very violent, and by now assembling a big electoral coalition, because by now the economy has gone to shit, and that people are looking at either communism or something radically different, and so again, the president handed Hitler the keys to power on a particular day. It was still a democracy. There was an election afterwards, albeit with the communists again in jail, and then, but as what took Mussolini 7 years to install a dictatorship took Hitler 6 months. By then, no party system. By the middle of 1933, no party system. Right. Today's fascists don't see that as the way to power. They see it like this. People like Trump, people like Marine Le Pen if she wins in France, people like Bolsonaro create a huge space in society for fascism to do what it really wants to do, which is to populate people's minds with what we call a social myth. The mythology of great replacement. The mythology that cultural Marxism is a disease propagated by minorities. The mythology that that violence is good, and that progress is bad, and that the most suppressed people on earth are white men in Europe. That's what they want to do. They're quite happy doing what we call meta-politics. That is, the politics of the mind, the politics of the network, the politics of the social media page, the politics that exists subcutaneously in many British towns, in local, private, secret Facebook groups, where, I mean, to give you one example, in the Hartlepool by-election, when Labour was fighting the Tories, and there's a bit of a right-wing vote in Hartlepool, not massive, but far-right vote, but not massive. Somebody somewhere was systematically pumping out the idea that Keir Starmer had let off Jimmy Savile while knowing that he was a paedophile, right? So that's what we call a social myth. It is untrue, but somebody was pumping it out there. That's where fascism is now. That's what it's doing. It's quite happy to have people like Trump in power until what? When the possibility of a democratic removal of somebody like Trump, or as we will see in Brazil, somebody like Jair Bolsonaro, then the fascists mobilize, because their message is, it's going to be very unpleasant for you, democracy, to remove this person. We envisage the 21st century being a century of permanent right-wing populist government. And I think one of the big clashes, the clashes that will come and are coming between the democratic state and fascist movements do occur at that moment when the chosen one, the right-wing populist leader, is under threat. Having said that, what are they waiting for? They're waiting for a mixture of climate change and mass migration, or interethnic conflict in a country like France between the Muslim minority and the non-Muslim majority. They're waiting for that to kick off, and then they go in. Even in the last few weeks, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a borderline right-wing populist fascist organisation, it has a fascist wing. They've gone straight into those floods in Germany, doing self-help kind of stuff. We're here to help you. Some of the residents, Nord Rhine-Westphalen is not a right-wing area; it's a called liberal area, and some of the residents have gone F off. But everything's a practice run for them. For the moment when they, as I say, they get the carbines out and they get the bean tin stash out, and it's now every man for himself. Being the operative thing.
The preppers have come out of their basements.
The preppers are no joke. The preppers are clearly part of the fascist phenomenon. In Germany, this group Nordkreuz. Nordkreuz sounds like a sci-fi comic, doesn't it? Yeah. Nordkreuz, Northern Cross, including mainly ex-police, ex-army, storing weapons, storing food. They made a list of 25,000 individuals who should be killed on the day the civil war starts. Most of the people I know in Germany would be on that list. They're no joke. In a way, because what we do, they've been prosecuted and dissolved. But what we do is we treat it as terrorism, quite rightly, because it is terrorism. But it's terrorism, and it's something else. It's a political movement. I hope what I've tried to do in that answer is to kind of explain the difference because we're not seeing a rerun of the 30s. The terrifying thing is there are new factors driving this. Climate is one of them. Technology and technological enablement. In Stalin's Russia, and even in Nazi Germany, I understand, typewriters were heavily policed. Who had a typewriter was known. Where's this typewriter? Well, we've all got these now, and nobody's going to take those away from us. So the networked acceleration of fascist ideas, as we saw with QAnon, I think is probably the biggest difference.
Well, what's incredibly pernicious for me is this idea that, you talked about Duggan just now, and he had this quote which I found to be incredibly couldn't get my head around it, is the fact that everything is bad, the idea of progress is bad, the idea of technological development is bad. And you go on to say is that he even claims that the scientific tradition established by Newton is bad, and that all teaching it is based upon. And I'm like, how do you combat an ideology that argues the fundamental definitions of science?
Yeah, I mean, Alexander Dugin is probably the most profound of thinker among these traditionalists, but he's not the only one. There are equivalents in many other cultures. What we're seeing here, and I think this is very important to get your head around. When I was in my 20s, and I was an active anti-fascist in the Anti-Nazi League, the skinheads we were dealing with, in public they carried Union Jacks, but in private they wore swastikas. We used to kind of out them. We used to publish pictures of them in swastika armbands. The National Front. They were what I would call like a tribute band to Nazism. So they'd seen fascism. They liked it. They knew it wasn't particularly relevant to their own time. They knew they wanted to keep it going. In the process, they would kick a few Pakistani people's heads in. Daubs a few Jewish graves with abuse. That's what they were. What we're seeing now is not a tribute band to the 1930s. We're seeing a new fascism regrown from its original philosophical roots. And here's where you've got to get your head around this. The philosophical roots of Hitler and Mussolini lie in a period from around 1890 to the First World War, when irrationalism became really cool, fashionable indeed. Now, you might think, well, why? Well, if you love, maybe some people listening to this podcast who are music lovers. If you love the music of somebody like Debussy or Delius, that late Romanticism, or if you love, symbolist poetry, it was in the air that rationality can't explain everything, and so lots of left-wing and right-wing people, basically all inspired by this philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, adopted the idea that yes, science can explain some things, but intuition has to explain other things. And there was even a whole theory called Vitalism, which said, in addition to the physical world, which we can measure and understand through science and biology, there is a non-physical world where a life force courses through everything, determining the way things happen. And we can only understand that life force through intuition. Now, we can ridicule this, but who listening to this has not had their tarot cards done, or their horoscope, or even, I do Tai Chi, right? I do Qigong. I don't believe Qi exists, but what we're talking about, Qi, is the life force. I believe it's a physiological thing. I do it because it makes me feel good. But, right, so
you don't believe it runs through you like Kung Fu Panda?
Absolutely. No. That was big before 1914. Another thing that was big was racial science. So the idea that there was a hierarchy of races, Nordic Europeans at the top, West Europeans below them, Mediterraneans below them, the Jews, Hindus, Copts and Muslims below them, and at the bottom, guess who? Black Africans. And below them, Aboriginal peoples of Australasia. That's the race hierarchy. Now, what happened in World War One was that lots of people got traumatized, and they came out of the First World War. Some of them thinking never again. In fact, fuck capitalism. Let's overthrow it. There were huge revolutions. Germany, Russia, of course, Italy. Even in Britain, there was a general strike after World War One. There was a revolutionary mood among workers, but among middle-class people, it was bizarrely, among some of the young men, and one of them, Ernst Jünger, I talk about in the book, I liked the war. The war was quite good. I felt alive. And indeed, all these spiritual things like vitalism and essence and intuition were unleashed in me by that war. And now it's boring, to be honest. I don't like the peace. Those were the first fascists. It was people who'd bought the whole irrationalist philosophy. They came out of the war saying, we want more destruction. In fact, one of them, Mussolini's right-hand man, Italo Balbo, said about his conversion to fascism, I came out of the war really bitter. I wanted to destroy everything. Now, what's happening with Dugin, to go back to him and the traditionalists, they are resurrecting the philosophical tradition of Nietzsche, of irrationalism, of another guy, Bergson, the inventor of the idea of vitalism, and of course of race hierarchy. And instead of having to be a kind of tribute band to somebody else's fascism, thousands of fascists today are able to co-create a new fascism. Almost, you could do it if you wanted to without reference to Hitler or Mussolini. You only need to refer to those pre-war writings about history, power and race, and you can construct the thought architecture of modern fascism independent of Hitler and Mussolini. That's why I think, you asked earlier, why are we seeing fascism everywhere rather than just in Europe? Remember, it was in America. There was a big fascist movement in America in the 30s. Why are we seeing it in the third world, in the developing world, in the global south? Because it's able to regrow itself in the new atmosphere from the same rootstock. And that is almost the essential message of the book. That to understand this, like to my generation, of course, the people who will do the fighting and are doing the resistance are generally young, and they weren't around to see those kind of closet Nazis in the 1980s. But my generation's still alive. I'm 61. Most people my age still think, when they think of the far right, they think of the Nazi tribute band. They don't understand that there's a virulent, co-created, self-organized, networked movement like QAnon or the Querdenker in Germany. That is reborn. It's fascism reborn. And what's the scariest thing? That the fascists themselves predicted it. This is why I start my book with this metaphor of time travel. The fascists themselves said, one day, completely unlike us, we won't even recognize them as fascists. One day, a new order of Sparta, as they put it, will be born. And because they said the essence of fascism is not concentration camps and swastikas and uniforms. It's the concept of man and freedom. What is freedom for fascism? Is the freedom to kill and destroy. And what is the concept of man? Is the concept of a white man at the top of an apex of a pyramid, below which are every other colour of man and all women and all gays, lesbians, transgender people. That concept of man and freedom is just alive. I'm sorry, it's alive all around us, and we need to tune ourselves into it and learn how to listen to it and listen for it among especially young people. The gamer guy, 16-year-old with his gamer. What is he saying? He's saying some of this bullshit, unfortunately, and is certainly exposed to it. And we have to be really aware of what it is.
How much of it is related to the idea of the globalization of our whole world, about how, the idea of, you talk about it, it might have been on your website, I don't know if you reference it in the book, about the neoliberal self, the idea about how that has displaced a lot of people, and that the fundamental idea of that has sort of died. And what's the relationship between the death of the neoliberal self and globalization in reference to fascism?
Okay, well, in both this book and my previous one, Clear Bright Future, I argued that what we're essentially dealing with is again something that we know happened in the 1930s. We constructed a self around the idea that free markets are good and that they will deliver for us. And the more you obey the market, the happier you're going to be. The more you anticipate that you're going to lose your job, that you schedule a meeting with somebody and they don't turn up. The total mercuriality and unpredictability of life is kind of, you've just got to accept it and become a kind of dog-eat-dog kind of person. And a kind of, that's why the heroes of that world were the kind of favela-dwelling crooks of, the kind of organized criminals, cool, the kind of, hip-hop rap people, kind of screw you, I'm looking after myself, I'm going to bling, I'm all right. Okay, that was the kind of hero of the neoliberal era. Whether it was a hedge fund guy, you know, with billions of dollars under control, or the local hoodlum. Right, now, all of us constructed a self around it. And the reason I know this is because I did have a different self. I grew up in the 1960s in a world that was orderly, where the market didn't rule, where most people in my town worked for the state, where the state provided you with free education, dentistry, and everything else, free milk, free food, almost cheap to the point of free energy. That world, when everybody looked after each other and knew each other, and there was a thriving community, the self I had then, and my dad, his self, was unchangeable around that world. That's why when it collapsed, he was really, really depressed. He just said, like a lot of people, if this is the future, I don't really want it. Now that neoliberal self, which constructed itself so perfectly around a functioning market, is faced with the fact that we don't have a functioning market, and that markets everywhere are propped up by states and central banks. Without central bank money printing, there would be no capitalism. All our banks would be bust. All the companies who make our cars, who make our computers, wouldn't exist. That's how close we came in 2008. People know this, and so they've gone, okay, well, the world no longer makes sense with this kind of. Remember one thing about neoliberalism, or the free market ideology, is that it was all encompassing. It said, history has ended. Nothing better than this can be imagined. There's no point struggling for things like communism or socialism. Capitalism will sort all problems out, even climate change. You know, all problems will be technocratically solved. Francis Fukuyama said, life will be pretty boring. You know, the interesting people will be like terrorists. You know, they will be able to live out heroism, but for the rest of us, there'll be no heroic narratives. That's for the movies. Okay. It collapsed. It makes no sense. That it is literally not true. It can be disproved by walking into your local high street where there's the remnants of an economy. Now, people don't go, right, I had one big idea that completely guided my life for the first 20 years of my life. Say if you're a millennial now or a Gen Zer. They don't say, well, there was one big idea. Can I replace it with 10 other ideas, all different and jumbled up? No, they go, well, give me one big idea to replace neoliberalism. Because we, the left, have failed in our fight to win an argument that what's it called? Another world is possible. There's even a movement called Altermondialism. You know, another world is possible, another future, a better, greener, more socially just future is possible. People say, well, what's left if it's not the economy? And then they look at themselves, and there it is, the white skin. You know, or in Brazil, the fairly white skin, the non-Indian, the non-indigenous skin, and in India, it's the Hindu ethnicity, the Hindu belief, and not the Muslim belief. And there's caste as well in India, and all over the world, we're getting people returning or seeking a holistic vision of the future, and unfortunately, fascism provides one. As I said before, it is the three based on the three things, on the idea of a reversal of modernity. Let's go back to the past and celebrate irrationalism. Forget science, forget law. First, 2, races are hierarchies. We're at the top. That's great for us. And in the really dangerous version of it, eco-fascism is for us to survive, there can't be economic development in the global south, so they have to die. And the eco-fascists, you know, Hitler thought in millions, 6 million Jews, 20 million Russian citizens dead in World War II. Eco-fascists think in billions. They're talking about getting rid of 6 out of the 7 billion people on Earth. And then the third part of their, which we haven't talked about, the third part of the new holistic fascist vision is a theory of power, which is that states need to be homogeneous. A state needs a population that is roughly the same, everybody's the same as each other. It can't tolerate difference, either ideological or physical difference. That was the theory propagated by a German lawyer called Carl Schmitt. and it is ultra popular today. You will hear Carl Schmitt's name thrown around in polite dinner parties, and that too is dangerous.
How does one, like perhaps myself, as someone who's not part of an organization, like a formal organization against fascists, or hasn't dedicated a lot of time to it, how does someone like me or someone listening to this, so that the age group of listeners into this podcast is mostly between 18 to 34.
Brilliant.
So they're sort of they're looking at the world and they're thinking, how do I fit in this? What do I do? Do I play the game of capitalism and sort of hoard as much as I can, or do I go and become a social activist and I grow a new type of future in the face of climate change and in the face of what they desire as well out of the world? How does someone like us or a generation look to the fascists of the past and present and formulate something that they can create and mold?
So in the book, I've suggested three things, which I'll say just generically before talking about how it would apply to 18 to 35 age group. First, we need to reclaim the ethos of anti-fascism. If you get this book, this is my copy, the proof copy. If you get that book out on a tube train in London, there you go. If you get that book out on a tube train in London, you'll be all right, probably. If you go to a town that's voted 25% Brexit Party and has got a strong far right, and you get it out in a pub, who knows? But for my dad's generation and my mum's generation, this was unthinkable. You know, their generation fought the Second World War. The idea that anti-fascism might be controversial was weird. But what's happening is that Trump, above all, is using the word Antifa. In America, they say it Antifa. Okay, using the word Antifa, anti-fascism, to create the idea that anti-fascism is terrorism. Now, we've got to reclaim the ethos of, say, anti-fascism is not terrorism, it is defense of democracy. Simple, pure and simple, the defense of democracy and the rule of law, and forcing the police to enact the rule of law and not to break the law themselves, and to arrest fascists when they attack people or when they scrawl graffiti on graves and the rest of it. That's number one. The ethos of being able to get that book out in public is almost the first act. Second, we're going to need a political alliance of the centre and the left. And I've spent my last 10 years as a Marxist, as a left-wing activist inside the Labour Party, fighting liberalism. You know, I saw liberalism in the form of the European Union and the IMF and the European Central Bank destroy a left-wing government in Greece just because they didn't like what it was doing. So I am not a big fan of liberalism. But what I know is that liberalism and Marxism are both products of the Enlightenment, products of the aspiration to think scientifically about society, and also products of the aspiration to a deeper democracy and a more just world. The word social justice, by the way, is not a Marxist concept, it is a liberal concept, and of course a Catholic concept before that. And it's something around which I think we can unite. The idea that the centre and left parties can temporarily unite to defeat people like Trump, Bolsonaro, Marine Le Pen in France. Yes, it's hard because we don't agree with each other. Yes, there will be compromises. And as I point out in the book, in France in 1936, where this worked, the compromises were huge, but they worked. So that's point two, a popular front, the new popular front. Point three, again, people are going to be whoa over this. Militant Democracy 2.0. Militant democracy was this slogan in the 1930s, which said, yeah, we love having 1 million people on the streets against fascism. We love the idea that the centre and the left have temporarily united to form a government in France and Spain, but the fascists aren't going away, and we need laws that repress them. So I would like to see an anti-fascist law. In the 30s, what did it meant? Basically banning militarised parades, controlling the supply of arms, which the fascists were always getting hold of all over the world, monitoring foreign funding. All of these things can already be done. Of course, banning militarised parades, in theory can be done, but the Charlottesville demo in 2017 was a militarised parade and a torchlit march on which young men chanted, "The Jews will not replace us." That wasn't banned. It was up to the demonstrators to try and stop it, and they did try and stop it, one of them being killed in the process. So we're going to need laws, and I think of course, what the modern version of it is laws that suppress advocacy or fantasy about genocide. Online, you see a lot of talk about genocide. In the book, I write about one particular group of Nazis who lived in an area of Berlin called Charlottenburg, which is a posh area of Berlin, which had a little working class enclave. And they were stormtroopers. They had a pub, and I walked from this pub, which today it's an architect's office, and there's no mention of the fact that it was the Nazi terror centre and indeed torture chamber when they came to power. I walked from it to all the places where they killed people, and it was really clear to me that, I mean, it's a lovely area now. It's full of kindergartens and tennis courts and beautiful parks, but at the time, this was a terror. This was a terror activity. Now, you can fight them. You know, the communists fought them on the streets. That's why they all got killed. You know, but easier would be to shut down the pub. You know, easier would be to have laws and police forces that understand if you are opening a terror centre in a working class neighbourhood, then it's not a good idea. And we need laws that actually limit their ability to do it. No. So those three things: anti-fascist ethos, new popular front, new anti-fascist laws. What can young people do? I have young relatives who study politics, and one of the reasons I wrote this book is because I wanted them to understand better what's going on. Now, I think this generation is the most educated in human history. I'm in awe of them. Their ability to mobilise facts and knowledge is superb. Their ability to pass exams is superb. Their ability to challenge existing knowledge is not superb, in my experience. There's a kind of deference, and you have to have the ability to say, for example, one eminent British historian, Richard Evans, looking at Capitol Hill, said, "This is not fascism. You know, it's got nothing to do with it. Fascism was something that happened after the First World War." I've written 3 books about it. He has, and they're brilliant books. But he's wrong. And this generation's got to have the courage to say to older people who think they know about fascism, "You're wrong." It's also got to have the urgency to understand that climate change, which is the number one thing for most young people, and personal freedom, so the freedom to be, you know, transgender or non-binary, or just to be yourself, whoever you are, in whatever little subculture you are, goth and emo, whatever. Those are the 2 things that matter. Forget both of them if fascism wins, because fascism will impose itself. The state. Just bother to read Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism. He says under fascism, the individual lives for the state only. And climate change, there's 2 fascist answers on climate change. One, it doesn't exist, which is the climate denial. And then the eco-fascism one, which I've referred to, which is let's kill 6 billion people. You have to live in that world. One of the only virtues of being 61 is to be able to say to people, when I was 25, we had fascism corralled. They couldn't hold a meeting in East London without we went in, and, you know, without, you'd say, going into too many details, they went away quite quickly and they never came back. Yep. That doesn't work. There's too many of them. The ideology is too deeply penetrated. They are coming, they are waiting for the moment when the floods hit Britain, when the forest fires hit Britain, when towns in Britain are underwater, as East London was underwater. And then we become refugees. The white English people and our black and Asian brothers and sisters become refugees. And who pops up is the fascists saying, right, well, you know what this means? This means anybody coming here on a boat needs to be machine gunned. And I'll tell you, there are people out there, I met them during the 2019 general election, even in my own hometown, who are fantasizing about rounding up refugees and taking them somewhere. They never say where, but neither did the Nazis. The Nazis used to write to each other. I've written about this in the book as well. The last chapter is about this guy, Odilo Globocnik, who organised the Holocaust, who personally responsible for 2.5 million Jews being murdered. He was continually badgering Hitler, writing him telegrams saying, "I like to be able to send the Jews across the river." You know, that's what that if you hear people say, I want to get rid of all the Romanian migrants in this town, put them in a van and take them somewhere, those two thoughts are pretty similar. And so I'd say to the young, you're going to have to live with that world. And that world is there for probably decades until you defeat it. It's not going away.
The difficulty it's a very scary thought, the one that you've just said, and it's very true, and it's definitely happening, is the idea that when people have this idea about getting rid of a certain ethnicity and they have a fear of migrants, it's the fact that it's not just the migrants, it's the ones that fit under the migrants ideology that are currently in your country.
Absolutely.
That then you have an excuse to get rid of them, and that's the very scary thing.
It's very interesting that if you look at the British far right, it's British far right since 9/11, which 20 years. British far right saw an opportunity to go massively Islamophobic. So all the far right groups were basically banging on about Islamophobia. So they were picketing halal meat shops. They were trying to boycott Walker's crisps and all this kind of stuff. They were also pretty against East European migration. They would say, well, we don't like East Europeans. But then again, they were white Christians, most of them. And then they were also, they didn't like refugees. But actually, there weren't that many refugees. We're an island. So the refugee thing went away. What happens? Black Lives Matter. I saw it with my own eyes because I went undercover on this demonstration organised by the Democratic Football Lads Alliance. The DFLA is a bunch of boneheads the same age as me. I probably fought some of them in the anti-fascist era. They're the huge guys, they're man babies, wandering around drunk. Thousands of them wandering around drunk around the Churchill
littering
statue.
Everywhere.
Literally peeing everywhere, shouting at the police. Okay, but they believe that they're not fascists. They believe that they're just kind of patriots. Okay, but what's really interesting, they used to say that they were primarily anti-jihadi. Well, that means it's Islamophobia. They're anti-Muslim. But Black Lives Matter tipped them straight back to where they were always going to end up, which is being anti-black. The people they now fear are Black Lives Matter. It's John Boyega doing his demo, in Hyde Park. It's Black Lives Matter.
Rashford.
Yeah, it's all it's the three footballers. And that's so what we've seen is that fascism is quickly migrating towards a universalist hatred. It has to. That's its logic. And in the book, one of the things we must recognise is those guys in the Charlottenburg Sturmabteilung, they may have sat around all day reading Hitler or being read Hitler to them because they were young, unemployed people. They may have sat down at night getting drunk and then stabbing people late, after midnight. But they didn't know what a genocide looked like. They had no experience. There was no documentaries. There's been the Armenian genocide in 1913, but there was no, film documentaries about how to do it. Every fascist knows how to do a genocide. And that's what's so scary when you see the word on Discord channels. People are killing each other in games. They're going, yeah, this is genocide. And sometimes they'll swap pictures of the Holocaust or other genocides like Rwanda. A lot of modern fascists, the hardcore, this is how you know a fascist, that genocide is there. This is what, for me, makes the most scary. I'm sorry to be scary. I would love to have written a happy book, and I am happy because I'm happy about the level of resilience that young people have against this. The scary thing is that if you go to one of these concentration camp museums, like Majdanek is the one I went to in Lublin in Poland. It's flimsy, wooden huts, concrete posts, barbed wire. It was electrified at the time, but 500 people escaped. The Nazis were so worried about a mass escape that they shot everybody towards the end of the war over a 2-day period, everybody who was left, because they knew they couldn't keep people inside. Nobody would escape a modern concentration camp. It would be like Guantanamo. And that's the scariest thing. Look at China. Uyghurs in China. Or it would just be like the Angola penitentiary in the United States. Top security, biometrics, barcoded, eyeball scanning, drones not dogs, but drones at the perimeter. Forget it. if there's another, and there's also, Majdanek was liberated by the Red Army, who would liberate us from a modern fascism. And so people who understand risk assessments, maybe some of your listeners are kind of professional risk managers, you go, maybe the risk isn't so great, but the magnitude of it happening, if it does happen, is probably bigger. So it's going to be worse. So that's what's made me like drop everything, because I've got much more interesting things to do and study and write about, and more positive things. Most of my work has been about the green post-work agenda after we get rid of capitalism, and I believe that's possible. But like, you can sit there, if you're sitting on a beach and you're dreaming of a post-work agenda, and then somebody's drowning in the ocean, you've just got to say, look, put the boot down, save the drowning person. And I think that's what we've got to do. It's democracy that's drowning, and we've got to look. It's an urgent issue, and we've got to convince ourselves that there's always a point of denial. This isn't really happening. That's what we've seen around Capitol Hill. We'll see it next year in France, when Marine Le Pen is going to, I think, she's going to get in the first round, such a high percentage that it becomes an immediate runoff between the far right and Macron. And the left's going to say, oh, fuck Macron. Macron's an Islamophobe. He's awful. He's been awful. Yeah. We're going to have more moments in the 2020s where right-wing politicians, far-right politicians combine, and far-right movements to really give us some scary events. I believe the other one will be coming in Brazil, if and when the left-wing Workers' Party manages to stage another bid for power with Lula, their leader, who's now been let out of jail. These are big democracies. India, the most populous democracy on earth.
Yeah.
United States, Brazil. We're not talking about kind of some tiny country nobody's ever heard of. So, yeah.
The Indian one's particularly scary as well, because my grandfather lived through the partition. So he was originally from India, then he got pushed up into Pakistan, and he tells me some of it. So all of his family were murdered. So his father, every one of my grandfather's family, and I look at what's happening in India, and I'm like, that's just exactly. He talks to me about it, and he's very worried for all the Muslim
this is why almost the first thing in the book I write about is the pogrom. Now, the word pogrom is a Russian word that refers to the mass murder of Jews in the 19th and 20th century. But if you look at what happened in northeast Delhi in February 2020, February 2020, it is pretty similar. It is BJP politicians mobilizing people against Muslim protesters. People go to the streets. They're filming themselves on their selfies. I think it's something like 39 people died. Numerous mosques and madrasas were torched. This was an anti-Muslim mass riot instigated by the government party. So, for who? For Trump, who had just landed at the airport, and they didn't want the embarrassment of having a demonstration. Now, I hope, in a way, because the Hindutva, as it's called, the Sangh Parivar, the Hindu chauvinist movement in India is very long standing. In fact, it was set up in the 1930s by followers of Mussolini and has coexisted with a secular democracy since 1947. One hopes that they're quite happy to coexist. They're not happy coexisting with an equal Muslim population, but one hopes that they don't resort to the next stage of that violence, and that indeed the Indian ruling elite, which has no interest, the Indian ruling elite can have, the business people, the Tata Steel people, can have no interest in mob violence. One hopes that they are able to hold that back, but you have to recognise it where it is. You have to, in a way, stop looking away. When I say looking away, it's not like looking away as if this hasn't happened. When a bad accident happens or some bad injury happens to somebody your first instinct is, I know that's horrible, but I don't want to look at it. We've got to basically force ourselves. And journalism, what I've been doing for the last 20 odd years, is I've always tried to bring what I call an unflinching gaze to the thing we're looking at. To look without flinching. Because by doing that, then you understand. Even if what you're trying to understand is sometimes almost inexplicably and horribly disgusting.
Probably the best way to describe your book in a good way. It's sort of like, I mean, the cover, you've got a little button to say how to stop. I mean, it's very much a looking at the thing that you don't want to look at, and you're reading about something that's not very pleasant to debate or to even think about that had actually happened in the early 1900s. And you're looking at it through the lens of today, and you're thinking concentration camps, you're thinking devices, you're thinking Discord groups, you're thinking of social media platforms who, in the book you sort of reference to say that they are the ones that are holding, they're the elite that we're challenging now. How do we push back their power? What are the laws in place? There are no laws in place. We've seen it the last couple of years with the social media channels. There's nothing to stop them. Who's stopping them? They're just freewheeling their way to power.
As my friend Aaron Balkan puts it, Facebook is malware. That's what it is. I'm on it because I need to be on it as a journalist, but I wouldn't be on it if I didn't. It's just malware, and there are many downsides to modernity, but I also think that we did once glimpse freedom. We glimpsed in the 2011 period those Arab Spring movements, occupation of the squares, and then Chile, Brazil, Euromaidan in Ukraine, Turkey, the Gezi Park occupation. I was there. This was a glimpse of freedom. I have never seen freedom so well expressed. Young people in Gezi Park, remember, it's a Muslim country run by a fanatical Muslim, Erdogan. Young people turn up and boys and girls sit together. They wouldn't publicly kiss, but they kind of would privately kiss, and then they do their homework. It's only about 12, but not 12, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds. There were anti-capitalist Muslims. There were people openly drinking beer and kind of taking the piss out of the government. It was a moment of freedom. You could feel it. I look back to my cell phone videos at the time. Just young people dancing together in defiance of this, what Erdogan wants, which is, alcohol off campus, no kissing in public, hijabs and all the rest of it. They were just saying, and by the way, there were hijabi women there. There were women in hijabs in the demo, defiantly saying, I'm a Muslim, but I'm an anti-capitalist. That glimpse of freedom, we kind of underestimate how powerful it was. For us, it was just an episode. It went away and other things happened. For the elite, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or people like Erdogan, they looked at it and said, that's how capitalism ends. When millions of people just say, I'm not going to live like this anymore. And a lot of people ask, well, why is fascism back? A lot of left-wing people say, fascism was a response to workers' revolution in the 1920s. Why is it back without a workers' revolution? Indeed, without a substantial workers' movement, full stop. And the answer is, it wasn't a reaction to workers' revolution. It was a fear of freedom. It was a reaction to the possibility of freedom by people who don't like freedom. It was a revolution against the revolution. And I believe those 2011 to 13 events were a revolution, albeit failed. And I also believe we might have another one. Young people are even more educated. They're even more dedicated to freedom. They're even more dedicated to their own rights and personal space. Why won't
education?
Yeah. Why won't we? Why would that generation stand by and allow a bunch of old men, which is what we're dealing with, Putin, Erdogan, Xi Jinping, Bolsonaro, Trump, why would they allow them to destroy the world? I can't see it. So I do think a clash is coming. To arm ourselves for it, we need one thing, which is a vision of the future, which my work has tried to create. There are other visions available. We need a combat strategy against the far right. And I think that the two things are what's going to define, in its broadest sense, modern progressive politics, modern leftism, modern liberalism. But any modern liberalism that's not interested in fighting fascism is suicidal.
Perfect, Paul. I think that's a great place to end it. That was such a great conversation, and thank you so much for taking the time to discuss your book, How to Stop Fascism. Got it right here. Where's the best place that people can find you, Paul? A website, social media?
paulmason.org is my website, and my social media, by far the easiest place, is at Paul Mason News on Twitter. Everything else is in the bio there.
Perfect. Thanks for taking the time, Paul.
Great.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www
booktalktoday.com to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.